The sound that ended Brenda Whitmore's little morning routine didn't sound like plastic cracking the way it had the last 57 times. It sounded like metal giving up on a bad idea. Coolant hissed across the pavement like someone had opened a soda can under pressure, and the white Escalade that used to glide past my driveway every morning sat there coughing and steaming in the pale Ohio sunrise, while Brenda stood beside it with her mouth open like the universe had just personally insulted her. I leaned against the porch railing with my coffee still warm in my hand, breathing in that cold early morning air that always smells faintly like damp grass and motor oil in our neighborhood. And I remember thinking one simple thing. Some people learn the hard way when they pick the wrong neighbor to bully. But that moment, the one with the engine ticking and the birds going quiet and Brenda staring at the front of her SUV like it had betrayed her, didn't start that morning. That moment started 3 months earlier with a cheap plastic trash can and a woman who couldn't stand the idea that someone like me lived across the street. My name is Ethan Carter, 44 years old, licensed electrician, 22 years crawling through attics and breaker panels across Franklin County. I bought the corner house on Maple Ridge Drive right after my divorce finalized last spring. Nothing fancy. 3 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, and a driveway just long enough for my old Ford work truck and whatever project I'm fixing on weekends. My kids, Luke and Hannah, stay with me every other weekend, and the place felt like a decent reset button. Quiet street. Decent schools. The kind of neighborhood where lawn mowers hum on Saturday mornings and people wave when they pass each other on evening walks. At least that's what the real estate agent said. What she didn't mention was Brenda Whitmore. Brenda lives 2 houses down in a brick colonial that probably costs twice what my place does. 52 years old, widow, drives a white Cadillac Escalade polished so bright it looks like it came out of a showroom every morning. She's the kind of person who carries a measuring tape in her purse and talks about community standards like she's defending the Constitution. Around Pine Ridge Estates, Brenda isn't technically HOA president anymore, but nobody seems to. Remember that detail when she starts pointing at things and telling people what they're doing wrong. The first time it happened, I thought it was an accident. Tuesday morning, trash pickup day. I'd rolled my bin to the curb before leaving for a job rewiring a duplex downtown. Around 6:15, I heard a sharp crack through the kitchen window, the sound of plastic splitting open like a dropped toolbox. When I stepped outside, the trash can lay flattened on the asphalt and coffee grounds and cereal boxes were scattered across my driveway like confetti after a parade. Brenda's Escalade rolled past at the end of the street, brake lights glowing red for a second before she turned the corner. I replaced the bin that afternoon. $23 at Home Depot. No big deal. Except the next Tuesday morning, at exactly 6:15 again, I heard that same crack echo through the quiet street. And that's when I realized it wasn't an accident. It was a routine. By the third trash can I stop believing in coincidences. The sound was always the same, a hollow crack that bounced off the quiet houses just before sunrise, followed by the low rumble of a large engine easing forward like nothing unusual had happened. Pine Ridge Estates is the kind of neighborhood where mornings move slowly. Sprinklers click on. Dogs stretch across warm concrete. The air smells like fresh-cut grass and somebody's early coffee drifting through an open kitchen window. Nothing dramatic ever happens here, which is probably why Brenda thought she could keep doing it. The second can lasted exactly 6 days. I bought it on a Thursday afternoon, rolled it carefully to the curb the following Tuesday, and went back inside to pour cereal. 6:15 arrived with the same heavy growl of that Escalade engine moving down Maple Ridge Drive. Then came the crack. When I stepped outside again, the lid was split straight down the middle and a trail of orange juice cartons and newspaper flyers ran halfway down the gutter. Brenda's white SUV rolled slowly past my driveway just then, the sunlight bouncing off the chrome wheels so bright it almost hurt to look at. She glanced at me through the driver's side window and gave a small smile, the polite neighborhood kind that looks friendly if you do not know what it really means. I told myself to keep calm. Accidents happen. Large vehicles, narrow streets, early mornings. That is what reasonable adults say to themselves when they want to believe the world makes sense. I cleaned up the mess, rinsed off my hands in the garage sink, and drove to work where a breaker panel waited in a basement that smelled like old paint and damp wood. But when the third one broke the following week, right at the same minute, right at the same patch of curb, the pattern stopped looking like bad luck. It looked like timing. It looked like someone turning the same page of a routine every Tuesday morning. I started paying attention. Brenda's schedule turned out to be as predictable as a wall clock. 6:10, the garage door at her place would lift with a long mechanical groan. 6:12, the Escalade engine would start, a smooth, expensive hum that carried down the street like a distant generator. 6:15, she would roll past my driveway on her way toward the subdivision exit, always a little too close to the curb, always at the exact moment my trash can stood waiting by the street like a bright plastic target. I tried the polite approach first. One afternoon I caught her while she was checking her mailbox. The air smelled like hot asphalt from a road repair truck down the block, and cicadas buzzed in the trees like tiny chainsaws. I explained calmly that the cans had been getting knocked over, and asked if maybe the turn leaving the street was tighter than it looked. Brenda listened with that same calm smile, the kind that never quite reaches the eyes. She folded her arms and told me these roads were designed for normal traffic flow, and that obstacles placed near the curb could sometimes create issues for responsible drivers. Obstacles. That was the word she chose for my trash, considering exactly where the city sanitation department requires it to be every Tuesday morning. She said it gently, like she was offering advice to someone who simply did not understand how things worked in a neighborhood like this. Then she walked back toward her house without another word, heels clicking against the sidewalk in slow, confident steps. That was the moment I realized this was not about traffic or plastic bins, or even the curb. This was about control. And Brenda Whitmore had decided the quiet electrician on the corner lot was going to be the easiest place to start. The next Tuesday morning, I did not need an alarm clock. The low mechanical hum of Brenda Whitmore's Escalade carried down Maple Ridge Drive right on schedule, the same steady engine note that had started to feel like a warning siren in my own house. 6:15 arrived with that now familiar crack, sharp and hollow, followed by the quiet rustle of trash sliding across pavement. When I stepped outside, the early light was still gray and thin, the kind that makes the street look half asleep, and my third replacement bin was lying on its side again, with a trail of coffee filters and grocery ads scattered down the curb. The smell of damp cardboard and yesterday's leftovers drifted through the cool air, while the Escalade rolled slowly away at the end of the block, like nothing unusual had happened. I stood there for a moment with my hands on my hips, watching that white SUV disappear around the corner, and the realization settled in my chest like a small heavy tool dropping into a toolbox. This was not carelessness. This was routine. The pattern repeated again the following week, then the week after that, always at the exact same minute, always with the same careful glide of tires hugging the curb. By the time the fifth trash can cracked open, even the neighbors had started to notice. Pine Ridge Estates is quiet, but it is not blind. Curtains move. Porch lights click on. People glance through their kitchen windows when strange sounds break the calm of early morning. One evening, my neighbor from across the street, Mrs. Davenport, mentioned gently that she had seen the white SUV pass extremely close to the curb several times during trash pickup mornings. She said it carefully, the way people in polite suburbs try to avoid accusing anyone directly, but the meaning was clear enough. I thanked her, finished tightening the lug nuts on my work truck, and told her I appreciated the information. Later that night, I sat in my garage with the door half open, the smell of sawdust and electrical tape hanging in the warm summer air, and I started looking at things differently. When you work as an electrician long enough, you learn something about patterns. Circuits either carry power or they break. Wires either connect properly or something overheats. Every problem leaves evidence if you know where to look. The same logic applies to people. Brenda Whitmore had a pattern, and patterns can be measured. The next morning, I installed a small security camera above my garage door, the kind contractors often use on job sites. Nothing fancy, just a clear angle of the curb and the corner of my driveway. I also replaced the broken trash can again, because city sanitation rules are simple. Containers must be placed within 3 feet of the curb on collection day. Mine sat exactly 2 feet and 4 inches away when I checked with a tape measure. Perfectly legal. Perfectly visible. Perfectly predictable. Then I waited. The following Tuesday, the street was quiet again before sunrise. Sprinklers ticked softly in the distance, and the air smelled like wet grass and fresh asphalt warming under the first touch of sunlight. At 6:12, I heard the familiar lift of Brenda's garage door somewhere down the street. At 6:14, the smooth engine note of that Escalade started rolling closer. I stood inside my kitchen holding a mug of black coffee, watching the camera feed on my phone while the second hand on the clock moved slowly toward the same moment that had played out 6 times before. The vehicle entered the frame exactly the way I expected, drifting closer and closer to the curb until the front bumper touched the edge of the plastic bin. Then came the crack again, louder this time, followed by the quiet collapse of another trash can. But this time the camera saw everything, and as the white SUV drove away, the screen in my hand captured the exact path of those wheels sliding inches from my driveway. That was when the problem stopped being annoying and started becoming useful. The video file sat on my phone like a quiet little truth waiting for the right moment. I watched it 3 times that night sitting at the kitchen table while the hum of my refrigerator filled the room and the smell of leftover takeout drifted through the air. The camera angle was perfect. The curb, the driveway, the plastic bin standing exactly where city sanitation rules say it belongs. Then Brenda's Escalade rolled into frame with the slow confidence of someone who believes nothing in the world can touch them. The front bumper nudged the bin and the plastic folded like cheap lawn furniture. No sudden swerving. No surprise. Just a smooth little tap followed by the tires rolling forward like it was part of her morning routine. I paused the video right when the headlights reflected off the curb and leaned back in the chair, letting the silence of the house settle around me. There is something interesting about proof. Once you have it, everything changes. The next day after work, I stopped by the Pine Ridge Estates HOA office, which sits in a small brick building near the entrance to the subdivision next to a row of maple trees that always drop leaves too early in the fall. Inside, the place smelled like printer toner and carpet cleaner. A young administrative assistant sat behind the front desk typing something into a computer while a ceiling fan turned lazily above her head. I explained calmly that I had been dealing with repeated property damage involving a neighbor's vehicle and that I had video documentation showing the pattern clearly. She listened politely and took my name, then disappeared into the back office to speak with someone from the board. A few minutes later, a man named Carl Bennett came out holding a clipboard. Carl was the kind of HOA board member who always tries to look neutral, the sort of person who smiles carefully like he is balancing 2 different stories in his head at the same time. I showed him the video. He watched the clip once, then again, his eyes narrowing slightly when the Escalade nudged the bin over like it had done 6 times before. Carl cleared his throat and said that neighborhood disputes sometimes involve misunderstandings about curb placement and vehicle clearance. I nodded slowly, then pulled a tape measure from my pocket and explained that the bin had been placed 2 feet and 4 inches from the curb line every Tuesday morning, which was fully compliant with city sanitation guidelines. I even showed him the measurement from the footage where the curb and driveway lines were visible. Carl shifted his weight and said the board would review the situation. That phrase, review the situation, sounded a lot like a polite way of saying they hoped the issue would simply fade away. I thanked him for his time, stepped outside into the warm afternoon air, and watched a breeze move through the trees along the street. That was when I realized something important. Brenda Whitmore did not behave like someone worried about being reported. She behaved like someone who believed the rules would always bend in her direction. And people like that only change when reality becomes impossible to ignore. Over the next few days, I replaced the broken trash can again and set it exactly where the last one had been. Same distance from the curb. Same angle facing the street. Same quiet plastic shape waiting beside the asphalt. The difference this time was not the camera or the tape measure or the video saved on my phone. The difference was the idea slowly forming in the back of my mind while I worked long hours rewiring an old grocery store across town. Electricians spend their careers solving problems hidden behind walls and ceilings. Every system has a weakness if you study it long enough. By Friday evening, while the sun dipped low over Pine Ridge Estates and the neighborhood filled with the smell of backyard grills and fresh-cut lawns, I had started sketching out a solution that Brenda Whitmore definitely would not see coming. The idea came together slowly the way most practical solutions do, somewhere between the smell of sawdust in my garage and the quiet ticking of tools cooling down after a long day of work. Saturday evening settled over Pine Ridge Estates with that calm suburban rhythm I had hoped for when I first bought the place. Lawn mowers had gone silent. Porch lights flicked on one by one along the street. Somewhere down the block someone was grilling burgers, and the smell of charcoal drifted through the warm air like a reminder that most neighbors were normal people just trying to enjoy their weekend. I stood in my garage with the new trash bin leaning against the wall and studied it the same way I would study a breaker panel before wiring a new circuit. From a distance, it looked identical to the last 6 bins that had not survived Brenda Whitmore's morning drive. Same dark plastic body. Same hinged lid. Same pair of small wheels that rattled softly when you rolled it across concrete. The difference was not what you could see from the street. The difference was inside. Electricians spend years learning about structure and load distribution even when the job has nothing to do with electricity. Mounting panels, securing conduit, reinforcing equipment racks. Everything has weight limits and stress points. If you know where those points are, you can make something much stronger without changing how it looks. I set the bin on my workbench and began measuring carefully, marking quiet little pencil lines along the inside walls while the overhead garage light cast long shadows across the floor. The plan forming in my head was simple, legal, and completely within the boundaries of my own property. I was not interested in starting a fight. I was interested in ending a pattern. Over the next hour, I installed a reinforcement frame inside the base using materials that any contractor could buy at a local hardware store. Nothing complicated, nothing illegal, just a carefully balanced structure designed to keep the bin exactly where it belonged if something happened to nudge it again. When I finished, the trash can looked exactly like every other bin on Maple Ridge Drive. Plastic shell, hinged lid, 2 little wheels. It rolled across the driveway with the same hollow rattle as before. The only real difference was the weight. When I lifted it slightly, I could feel the extra stability holding it steady like a toolbox that refuses to tip over. Sunday morning passed quietly. I mowed the lawn, cleaned out my truck, and spent a couple of hours reviewing the camera footage from the previous weeks just to make sure my timing assumptions were correct. 6:12 the garage door opened. 6:14 the engine started moving. 6:15 the front bumper drifted toward the curb. Patterns are dependable things when people believe no one is paying attention. Monday evening, I rolled the reinforced bin out to the curb exactly the same way I had every week before. 2 feet and 4 inches from the curb line. Lid closed. Wheels facing the driveway. The streetlight at the corner flickered on as dusk settled across the neighborhood, and cicadas hummed in the trees like a quiet electrical current running through the air. Nothing about the scene looked different. Just another plastic bin waiting for the Tuesday sanitation truck, like dozens of others scattered along Maple Ridge Drive. But this time when I walked back toward the house, I felt the calm certainty that comes from understanding a system. Completely. Brenda Whitmore believed Tuesday mornings belonged to her routine. What she did not realize was that routines only work when nobody changes the conditions. And early the next morning, when the familiar engine sound rolled down the street again, those conditions were about to change in a way she absolutely did not expect. Tuesday morning arrived with the same quiet rhythm Maple Ridge Drive always had before sunrise, the kind of stillness where the only sounds are distant sprinklers clicking across lawns and the soft hum of power lines overhead. The sky was just starting to lighten into that pale gray color that comes before the sun pushes over the rooftops. And the air smelled like wet grass and the faint sweetness of someone's early coffee drifting through an open kitchen window. I stood inside my kitchen holding a mug of black coffee and watched the camera feed on my phone the same way a technician watches a control panel during a test run. The reinforced trash bin waited exactly where it had every week before, 2 feet and 4 inches from the curb line, lid closed, wheels resting quietly against the concrete edge of my driveway. Nothing about it looked unusual from the street. Just another plastic container sitting beside the curb like dozens of others along Maple Ridge Drive. At 6:12 the familiar mechanical groan of Brenda Whitmore's garage door drifted faintly down the block. I did not even need to see it to know what was happening because the pattern had repeated too many times already. 2 minutes later the smooth engine note of that Escalade started rolling through the quiet neighborhood like a distant generator warming up. It was a distinctive sound, the kind that carries across still morning air. I leaned against the kitchen counter and took a slow sip of coffee while the second hand on the wall clock moved steadily forward. 6:14. Then 6:15. Right on cue the white SUV entered the edge of the camera frame, gliding down the street with the same unhurried confidence it always had. Brenda liked to drive close to the curb when she passed my corner lot, drifting just a little farther right than necessary, like someone testing the boundary of a sidewalk without stepping over it. On previous mornings, that slow drift ended with the hollow crack of plastic folding under a bumper. This time the moment unfolded differently. The Escalade's front tire rolled closer, and the bumper approached the side of the bin the way it had every week before. But when it made contact, the trash can did not collapse or slide across the pavement. It stayed exactly where it was, steady and unmoved, the reinforcement frame inside the base absorbing the nudge like a toolbox planted firmly on a workshop floor. The SUV hesitated for a split second, as if the driver had not expected resistance from something that had always been easy to knock aside. Through the camera feed, I could see the brake lights flicker briefly before the vehicle corrected its path and continued down the street. No dramatic noise. No scattered trash. Just a moment of quiet confusion before the routine continued toward the subdivision exit. I set my coffee mug down slowly and replayed the clip on the screen. The reinforced bin had not shifted even an inch. The front bumper of the Escalade had tapped it gently and then moved past like a hand brushing against a wall that turned out to be stronger than expected. I could almost imagine the puzzled look on Brenda Whitmore's face behind the windshield as she drove away, wondering why the plastic target she had pushed around for weeks suddenly refused to cooperate. I stepped outside into the cool morning air and rolled the bin back a few inches toward the curb, making sure it still sat perfectly within the sanitation guidelines. The street was quiet again, the way it had been before the sound of cracking plastic started echoing through the neighborhood every Tuesday morning. The routine had been interrupted, and sometimes that is all it takes to make someone realize their habits are no longer working the way they used to. The next Tuesday morning felt different before anything even happened. Pine Ridge Estates still looked the same in the gray light before sunrise. Quiet houses lined up along Maple Ridge Drive, dew resting on the lawns, the faint smell of wet soil drifting through the air like it always does when the night cools down the pavement. But routines change once someone realizes they are no longer working, and I had a feeling Brenda Whitmore was not the kind of person who liked losing control of her routine. At 6:12, the distant rumble of her garage door rolled down the block again. I was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my phone resting beside it, the camera feed open and waiting. The reinforced bin stood by the curb exactly where it belonged, 2 feet and 4 inches from the edge of the street, perfectly within city sanitation rules. The quiet seconds stretched slowly until the familiar engine sound of that Escalade came drifting through the neighborhood again, smooth and confident like it owned the road. When the SUV entered the camera frame, I could tell immediately something had changed. Instead of gliding casually down the curb line like she had done for weeks, the vehicle slowed just a little as it approached my driveway. Not a full stop, not even enough to draw attention from anyone passing by, but enough to show that Brenda had noticed the trash bin had refused to move the week before. The headlights washed across the front of the house and reflected softly off the plastic lid as the vehicle rolled closer. The bumper drifted toward the curb again, the same quiet test she had performed so many mornings before. This time the contact was slightly firmer, more deliberate, like someone tapping a door to see if it was really locked. The bin did not budge. The reinforced base held steady against the pavement exactly the way I had designed it to. For a moment the Escalade paused with the front tire nearly touching the curb. Through the windshield I could see the silhouette of Brenda leaning forward slightly behind the wheel, the way drivers do when something unexpected happens. Then the brake lights flickered red again and the SUV pulled away, continuing down the street without another attempt. I watched the replay twice while the early sunlight began to creep over the rooftops. What mattered was not the contact itself. What mattered was the hesitation. Brenda Whitmore had spent weeks believing that my trash can was something she could push around without consequence. Now the small, predictable object beside my driveway had become something uncertain, something that refused to cooperate with her little morning routine. Later that afternoon, I was tightening electrical conduit in the ceiling of a grocery store renovation when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a neighborhood message posted on the Pine Ridge Estates online community page. Brenda had written a long complaint about improperly placed sanitation containers creating hazards for responsible drivers navigating the street. She mentioned corner lots specifically and described how certain homeowners needed to show more consideration for the safety of others. I read the message while standing on a ladder beneath fluorescent lights and could not help smiling slightly. Because the video clips on my phone showed something very different from the story she was trying to tell. When I got home that evening, I rolled the reinforced bin back to its usual spot near the garage and set the camera to record again for the following week. The streetlights flickered on as dusk settled across Maple Ridge Drive, and the calm suburban silence returned once more. Brenda Whitmore had started adjusting her routine, but the important thing about routines is that once they begin to crack, they rarely return to the way they used to be. The following week, the neighborhood message board was quieter than usual, but the silence felt different, like the calm that settles over a street when people realize a small drama has started unfolding in plain sight. Pine Ridge Estates may look peaceful from the outside, but people notice patterns even when they pretend not to. By Monday evening, several neighbors had quietly replied to Brenda Whitmore's complaint about hazardous trash placement, and most of those replies asked a simple question she did not seem prepared to answer. If the bins were dangerous, why did the issue appear only on one corner of Maple Ridge Drive, and only at the exact moment her vehicle passed by every Tuesday morning? I did not write anything on the page. I did not need to. The camera footage on my phone spoke clearly enough, and Carl Bennett from the HOA board had already seen the same clips a few days earlier. Tuesday morning arrived again, with that familiar early quiet, the sky pale and still while a thin layer of mist hovered above the lawns. I stood by the kitchen window holding a mug of coffee and watched the street through the glass instead of the camera this time. The reinforced bin waited at its usual spot beside the curb, steady and ordinary looking, the same dark plastic shape it had always been. At 612, Brenda's garage door lifted again down the block, the sound carrying faintly through the cool air. 2 minutes later, the Escalade rolled into view at the far end of Maple Ridge Drive. But something about the way it moved told me the routine had changed. The vehicle stayed farther from the curb this time, leaving a clear margin of space between the front bumper and the trash bin. The SUV passed my driveway smoothly, without touching the container at all, continuing toward the subdivision exit like any normal car on a quiet suburban street. I took a slow breath and watched it disappear around the corner. That moment might have looked simple to anyone else, but to me it felt like a circuit finally switching off after weeks of buzzing interference. The routine had broken. Later that afternoon, Carl Bennett knocked on my door while the late summer sun warmed the front porch. He stood there with his clipboard tucked under one arm and that careful HOA board smile on his face again. Carl explained that the board had reviewed the video clips and discussed the matter during their weekly meeting. Without accusing anyone directly, they had decided to send a general reminder to all residents about respecting private property and maintaining safe driving distances along curbside areas. It was the kind of message that allows everyone to save face while still making the point perfectly clear. I thanked him for the update and watched him walk back toward the sidewalk while the breeze rustled the maple leaves overhead. That evening, I rolled the trash bin back toward the garage after sanitation pickup, the small wheels rattling softly across the driveway. For the first time in 2 months, the container was still intact. No cracked plastic. No scattered garbage. Just a normal piece of household equipment doing the job it was meant to do. The streetlights flickered on as dusk settled across Pine Ridge Estates, and the calm neighborhood sounds returned, dogs barking in the distance, and someone closing a garage door down the block. Brenda Whitmore's Escalade remained parked quietly in her driveway that night, and the corner of Maple Ridge Drive felt peaceful again, the way it should have been from the very beginning. The following weeks settled back into the quiet rhythm Pine Ridge Estates had before the sound of cracking plastic ever echoed down Maple Ridge Drive. Tuesday mornings returned to the simple routine they were meant to have. The sanitation truck rumbled through the neighborhood just after sunrise, workers lifting bins with the steady mechanical clank of the hydraulic arm, while birds hopped along the curb looking for crumbs left behind on the pavement. My trash container rolled out to the curb every Monday night and came back to the garage every Tuesday afternoon exactly the way it should. No scattered garbage. No broken lids. No mysterious early morning collisions. Just the ordinary rhythm of a neighborhood that prefers calm over unnecessary drama. Brenda Whitmore's Escalade still left her driveway around the same time each morning, but now it traveled down Maple Ridge Drive with a careful buffer between its tires and the curb line. Sometimes I would see the vehicle pass while I stood on the porch drinking coffee before work. The white SUV moved smoothly along the center of the lane, giving every trash bin along the street plenty of room. From a distance, nothing about the change looked dramatic. There were no confrontations and no raised voices across driveways. The only real difference was a quiet shift in behavior that everyone on the street seemed to notice without talking about it directly. A few neighbors began waving more often when they walked past the corner lot in the evenings. Mrs. Davenport even joked one afternoon, while watering her flowers, that Maple Ridge Drive had suddenly become the safest place in Ohio to leave a trash container overnight. I smiled and told her that sometimes small problems solve themselves once people realize the situation has been paying attention to them all along. The reinforced bin stayed exactly where it belonged each week, steady and unremarkable, the kind of ordinary object nobody thinks about when life is running normally. But every time I rolled it toward the curb, I remembered the lesson hidden inside that quiet piece of plastic and metal. Most bullies rely on routine. They expect the world to keep reacting the same way every time they push against it. When nothing changes, their confidence grows stronger with every small victory. But routines break the moment someone studies them carefully enough to understand how they work. One evening near the end of summer, I sat on the porch watching the sky fade from orange to deep blue while the neighborhood lights flickered on along Maple Ridge Drive. The air carried that soft late season warmth that always arrives just before fall begins creeping into Ohio. Somewhere down the block a garage door closed and a dog barked once before settling down again. Brenda's house looked quiet across the street, the Escalade parked neatly in the driveway under the glow of a porch light. The reinforced trash bin stood beside my garage waiting for the next pickup day, its wheels resting lightly against the concrete like it had always been there. Looking at it now, you would never guess that something so ordinary had quietly ended a weeks-long routine that nobody else wanted to challenge. But that is the thing about solving problems the right way. The solution rarely looks dramatic after it works. It just restores the calm that should have been there all along.